Just in case there's anybody who hasn't been here, just real briefly, what we work on these questions: what, why, and how do we remember? We've talked about what saint and holiness means. We've talked about antecedents in Judaism, the calendar, various rituals, holy people, what early Christians did with that question of calendar and rituals and holy people, and how our ancestors morphed some of this in and overlaid it onto sort of Greco-Roman feasts, festivals, and things like that. We talked about martyrs and confessors, specifically martyrs, and how very early on, in the middle of the 2nd century, good old Polycarp over there on the right, we have the story of his martyrdom, and it's clear that people were hanging around either the place of his martyrdom or where he was buried and remembering him, and the idea that even in the New Testament that there were those in heaven that were praying on our behalf. And then we spent a good chunk last week talking about the impact of Constantine, and how there were a lot of additions to the calendar, not just holidays in the sense of Christmas and things like that, but specific remembrances of individuals and individual places. Certainly we think about his mother Helena and what she had built in Jerusalem, and then the Holy Week rituals and all of those, but also specific days began to be remembered among Christians. And that was kind of where we ended. The issue of remembering is, how do we remember? How do we bring to the present that which was in the past? What we in those earlier yet constant realities. That's that communion of saints that we think of that are there always. So that's what we've spent the last couple of weeks talking about. And today what I'd like to do is sort of move beyond that. We'll see how far we get. My hope is that we get up to kind of maybe the American church, is my hope. I think we will. And that will be a good sort of breaking point, but since we won't meet next week, a breaking point before we really start into what did the American church do with this calendar moving forward. So in the, once Constantine, sort of legitimized Christianity, and it was easy for Christians to move from place to place. But on the flip side, there wasn't this continual sort of creation of martyrs and confessors. That didn't stop this sort of multiplication of saints. And so there was that feast, All Saints or All Martyrs. And the role of saints began to change a little bit. And so rather than being witnesses or examples of what it would be like to be a holy person, a heroic holy person, the saints became intercessors or protectors. So the role of the saints shifted a bit because we weren't demanding, or at least in the Middle Ages, there were not as many martyrs. There were still some, but it was kind of individualized, not in the same way of the persecutions under the Roman Empire. And so then, of course, in the beginning of the 5th century, Rome falls. Rome is destroyed, and you've got the age of the Vandals and the Goths and the Visigoths and all of those folks. And we enter the Middle Ages, what some people would call the Dark Ages. A lot of historians don't like that phrase, that's for sure. And the role of saints really changed. the cult of saints became sort of the dominant form of religion in Christian Europe. And the best book, and I have it, I just cannot find it anywhere. I looked through all of my boxes at home. And I know this is not a book that I would have gotten rid of. But the best book on this is brilliant by a brilliant British scholar by the name of Peter Brown. And it was just called The Cult of the Saints. You can find it on Amazon. It's a short little book, but it's brilliant. And he's a fabulous writer. And it's not overly technical, but brilliant book. And so he explores in this book the role of tombs, shrines, and relics and pilgrimages, all connected with the sacred bodies of saints. And so people would go, of course, they would make a pilgrimage to a particular holy place where there was the remains or the relics of a particular saint. And, you know, he makes the case that normal everyday people, I don't want to sort of think about the peasants in Monty Python, but you can think about normal everyday people like the peasants in Monty Python. Oh, this is a good bit of fun. You know, that their lives were so harsh. And he, you know, so he shows how that these people in these harsh and sometimes barbaric times really relied on the merciful intercession of the holy dead.
Okay.
To obtain justice and forgiveness. And so the role of saints became so different. You know, Jesus became kind of way out there, and the increase in the sort of the cult around Saint Mary, around the Virgin Mary, was part of this too, trying to decrease the distance between humans and the divine. You know, so again, the saints change. But the other thing that happened at this time is that there was a trafficking in relics. And this became a way, and Brown points this out in really good detail, that this would be a way for cities or countries, kind of like marriages, intermarriages, would be to trade relics. And so not only did they have political significance, but if you had the right kind of relics, your pilgrimage, your town or your church would become this interesting site of pilgrimage and bring more people. So they had an economic benefit as well. So, you know, the saints became all sorts of things in the Middle Ages, well beyond just either intercessors or protectors or witnesses. They became an economic engine between all of these various places, mostly in Europe. This is mostly reflective of Europe. And he also shows how this religiosity centered around the saints, it engaged, as he put it, engaged the finest minds of the church. Everybody was doing this. And brilliance in poetry or in literature, patronage of the arts, and I've got some a slide here I'm going to move to in just a minute, to sort of show this art. You can see it certainly in this particular coffin here, this tomb here. But also towards the end of the Middle Ages, other saints, other feast days developed. So we had more feasts of Christ, including the Feast of the Holy Name and the Feast of the Transfiguration. The calendar began to increase. The various feasts of Mary, including the Visitation, increased. So all of these different ways of engaging the holy beyond just sort of going to church on Sunday. All of these ways increased during the Middle Ages. And then, of course, New Testament saints. For example, Saint Matthias, not one of the big apostles, but he gets sort of, voted in the book of Acts. So some of these other New Testament saints begin to be elevated in stature in terms of the larger calendar. And so part of this religiosity would be to go, of course, and see the relics. And so on the left, this is a reliquary, a container for a holy relic. This particular one is a relic of the true cross. Now, of course, if you had a piece of the true cross in your church, people from miles around would want to come and see it, right? And so the story goes that there were enough relics of the true cross to repopulate a forest, But if the Archbishop of one city says, I've got a relic of the true cross, I'll hack off a piece and send it to you. This would bind those two cities together. But you can look, this is from the 12th century in France. The workmanship on this in the 12th century is remarkable. Where were people putting their efforts, or the patrons of the arts clearly are in full display here. The upper right hand, this foot, you can see that big sort of thing on the upper bridge of the foot. That is a window into this reliquary. This is from 1450 in Basel. And within that reliquary, it was reputed to hold the foot bones of one of the holy innocents, one of these small children that was killed at the order of Herod, so that he could kill, so that Herod could hopefully kill Jesus. So here are the holy innocents, all of the feet. And again, the workmanship on this reliquary, quite amazing. Unfortunately, the picture down on the bottom right, I couldn't get it a better one, but this is theoretically the head of John the Baptist. And there were several heads of John the Baptist floating around Europe, just like there were lots of bits and pieces of the true cross. And one of the stories, clearly apocryphal stories, or maybe not so clearly apocryphal, was how can John the Baptist have had two heads and more than one head? And somebody said, well, this was his head when he was a baby. The point is that people invested a lot, and I don't mean monetarily, but that was the case too. But their spirituality was invested in these ways of having access to God. And this communion of saints that we hear about, in Hebrews 11, this was that way of bridging that gap between the sort of mortal life and the life of the heavenly realms. And clearly these saints were closer to Jesus or God than any of the rest of us. And so if we prayed for them to intercede for us, the idea or the thought would be that because of their proximity in holiness, or maybe physical proximity, if you can think of heaven in sort of a physical way, their presence in the heavenly realms, that would put them closer to God, and their prayers would be more efficacious. So the cult of saints expanded in a lot of different ways. There are some, and Brown talks about this. I looked and looked and looked to see if I could find a picture of it. There are some tombs that reputedly give off oils, and people will go in and collect these oils for healing properties. There are other tombs into which you would pour oil in one and it would come out in the bottom after having come in contact with the relic, and therefore have healing properties. I couldn't find any pictures of the latter. So it was all of the stuff that was connected with this, along with these sort of beliefs that going back to references we have in the book of Acts, that people believed that even cloth that Paul had touched would have healing properties. So the proximity, the physical proximity to the holy became really, really important. So this is what was going on all through the Middle Ages. And of course, we'll get to this a little bit more in a minute, but that ability to access the saints became, and their prayers became part of what led up to, and abuses surrounding that, what led up to the Reformation. And again, we'll get to that in just a bit. So how did one become a saint? And this picture here is Pope Pius II canonizing Catherine of Siena in 1461. So the history of how one became a saint, it went back to, again, very early times. The third bullet point there, that the local faithful would declare that someone, there was an early martyr, or there was somebody connected with you. But somebody to become a saint, someone has to sanction the veneration of a person as a saint. And so this would happen locally, certainly, with for example, with Polycarp of Smyrna. But certainly in some cases, there was general consent. These were holy people. And so that would be the Virgin Mary and the apostles and the evangelists. Everybody agreed that these people would be saints, right? And then there would be the local faithful would say, this person is holy. And a lot of times, it would be centered around questions of miracles that I prayed to Saint Swithin. And when I prayed to Saint Swithin, my ailment was healed, or something like that. Certainly, individual bishops canonized folks in their diocese. And then once these people were declared a saint, let's say in the Diocese of Lyon in Gaul, then you could start trafficking in their relics to the Diocese of Basel in Switzerland, or someplace else. And so these local bishops would canonize people, and then that would begin to spread throughout the church. So it started locally and moved out. It certainly wasn't because of faultless behavior, but because of the person's, their daily life was lived not merely well, but at a heroic level of Christian faithfulness and integrity. The key phrase being heroism. We're these heroes of the faith. And sometimes, again, this would be borne out in miracles or things like that. But clearly it was that heroism. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote that a saint, and I'll just use the language he used, or the translation. A saint is known to be good and charitable, living as a man among men, holding back nothing for himself, but using his every gift for the common good. The saint looks upon himself as every man's debtor, alike to friend and foe, to the wise and foolish. Such a one, being wholly humble, benefits all. So, there's this sense of heroism. Well, as time went on, and the multiplication of saints increased, in Rome, the final authority began to be given, of course, to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope, in the 10th and the 12th centuries. And he and the Curia and the College of Cardinals would be the final arbiter as to whether or not someone was canonized. So the individualized raising up might happen, but then you would take that individual to Rome. And we continue to see that, right? So we saw that with Teresa of Calcutta. Clearly a localized person, and then they went and made that claim to Rome. Oscar Romero, similarly, a local person that then, because of his sanctity, his heroic faith, was canonized through the process in Rome. And of course, that process is pretty well defined. The number of miracles and the time frame and all of those kinds of things. I don't want to go a whole lot into it because it sort of diverts us a little bit from where we would want to go. It's not really part of our tradition. But by the time all of this sort of was built up, there was this huge calendar of saints, many very, very localized, that then became canonized at Rome. This is called the general calendar, is what they call it, that really came up before about 1969. Even in the Roman Church, there was this general calendar, and then there was some sifting going on in the Roman Catholic Church that some of us may remember. That, well, was there really a Saint Valentine? I don't know about that. So there was this general calendar, and when the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church started adopting, the Episcopal Church in general started building its calendar, there was a lot that went back to sort of a general or an older calendar that Rome had used that really sort of we stopped accepting it about at the time of the Reformation. And we'll get to the Reformation in just a minute, but I want to stop and see if there are comments or questions that people have at this point.
One of the photos that you showed on a previous slide, it had, it was on the right. Yeah, there you go. And on the left side, why does that cross have two horizontal beams instead of just?
Oh, good.
And, and sometimes you see it at an angle too for the conservative or.
Right. No, that's a really good question, and it's a good question that for two reasons. One is, why is there that extra piece? But why is there that extra piece in Gaul, in the Meuse region of Gaul? Because usually the cross that you see there, the one with the second cross piece, is usually associated with Byzantine crosses rather than Latin crosses. And what that second piece up above is that notice that was nailed above Jesus's head. That said INRI, or this is, Jesus of Nazareth, all of that, the King of the Jews, that was hammered onto the cross that we read about in the Gospels, right? So, and whether it's perpendicular or at an angle, I think that's probably more, the style of the artist as opposed to anything technical. But it was also, so why is that used in Gaul rather than, as opposed to coming from Byzantium? But also, if you see a pontifical cross, the cross that the Pope would bear, oftentimes it would have a second, the official pontifical cross would have a second piece up there. So I think as time went on in the West, that upper piece disappeared. So that's a really good question. I could go get a dictionary and a Christian dictionary and might have a better explanation. But those are the two things that your question raises in me. First is that second piece really refers to the notice above Jesus's head, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, or Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That piece is that one I know for sure. When the Latin cross began to drop that in favor of just the simple two pieces, I'm not so sure, but it's very popular, very usual to see that in Orthodox churches.
Thanks.
Good question.
Thanks.
I heard somebody else.
Oh, I was bringing up the Shroud of Turin.
Ah.
I read the book written by the scientist who happened to be at the Air Force Academy. And he was one of the people involved in the very first time the Shroud of Turin was allowed to be touched. A little corner, a tiny little corner of the fabric was removed. And it was one that was stolen and then brought back and all of that. The image on the shroud does look like Jesus in many of the depictions, but finally it was decided it could not be a human being. But the shroud had gone through some interesting things. And one of the things it went through was a fire in a church, and the fire could have caused radiation to happen in this metal iron box that imprinted the body on it. Now, I just find all this science fantastic, but it's one that I think of with the relics, because it was scary to the French to let anybody even look at it.
Right.
The fabric is from the right period of time.
Yeah. There's so many interesting things about the shroud.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read about.
I think for our purposes, the shroud is a relic, and just like all of the rest of the relics, it just is a little closer. If it was actually Jesus' burial, a little closer to Jesus than Saint Teresa of Avila, for example. But so it's what is what that thing, what that is imbued with, the importance with which it's imbued, and how that is accesses the holy. Any other questions before we move to the Reformation? Okay. So, of course, early part of the 16th century, good old Martin Luther reportedly nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. And one of those, in general, I'll just say in general, and then we'll get specific about Luther and Calvin, but the Reformers, they were all about restoring the primacy of Sunday. After everything had been scattered all over the place with saints, this multiplication of saints and all of that, they really wanted to work to reform the church, to restore the primacy of Sunday. And so keep that in mind as we think about all of this sort of multiplication of saints. But you'll probably remember, depending on how good your memory is about Luther, is that he was really concerned about abuses of the series of about the practice of indulgences that Rome was selling, a sort of get out of purgatory free cards. Calling them indulgences. And the more money you spent, the less time you spent in purgatory. And that there was this question about the good deeds of saints, how they too would be able to help get you out of purgatory or lessen the time that you were in purgatory. So much of what Luther was or not much, but a lot of what Luther was protesting was this whole matter of indulgences and the saints. Now, that said, he wrote a letter in 1522, so this is 5 years after the nailing of the Theses. He wrote a letter to a guy named Paul Speratus. I don't know who this fellow was. But he writes in this letter, and I'll quote this, he says, "Satan is clever. Thus, even now among us, he is quibbling over the worship of saints and what the saints are conscious of in heaven. Thus, too, I would solve the question about adoring and invoking God dwelling in the saints. It is a matter of liberty, and it is not necessary either to do it or not to do it." So here's this former Augustinian monk who had his problems with the misuse of indulgences, but when it came to the matter of saints, he was pretty libertarian. It doesn't make any difference. Here he was Anglican, we'll say. We got him on one side, we got him on the other side. He didn't care, according to at least this letter from 1522. John Calvin, on the other hand, before I go on, so with Luther and the Lutherans, they restricted holy days to the feasts of our Lord, days of the apostles and evangelists, these ones that were generally agreed upon, St. Stephen, the Holy Innocents, St. John the Baptist, St. Michael the Archangel, and All Saints. Those were the holy days. It was a pretty restrictive calendar officially for the Lutherans under Luther. Calvin, on the other hand, rejected everything, right? No images of saints, no crucifix, no holy days, including Easter. There was just nothing on the calendar. He just got rid of it all. And that, because Calvin's theology became so prominent in Britain, we'll come back to Calvin in a moment. On the other hand, and so you have these radical Reformation people, the Amish and Mennonite folks, my forebears, literally my forebears, and I preached about this. They had a book. This was later on in the middle of the 17th century, but still, they had this book called The Martyr's Mirror. That was all of these Anabaptist martyrs who were killed for their refusal to pledge allegiance to either the Lutheran Church and Calvinist Church. And so among the Anabaptists, even though they, in some respects, were heirs of some of Calvin's theology, they still wanted to hold out holy people. They didn't necessarily celebrate holy days, but even today, the Martyr's Mirror among many Amish and Mennonite families is the second book that they have next to the Bible. This is still so prominent in their theology, how they remember who they are these stories of these holy people, even if they don't recognize them in the same way that, let's say, the Roman Catholic Church would remember saints, but how important these people were in terms of their formation. Questions? Thoughts?
I certainly know that Calvin's church, i.e. the Presbyterian Church, did reject images of saints, and there is no crucifix. There's the cross with the risen Jesus. And as I said earlier, I thought that, the people ended with John, the author of Revelation, and began with John Calvin.
Right.
Everybody else got forgotten.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So what happened in England? So we had, Luther in 1517 with the hammering of the theses. We saw, heard his letter to Paul Speratus in 1522. So not all, so Luther's theology began to work its way to England, as did John Calvin's. And of course, England separated from Roman Catholic Church with Henry VIII. We know this story. But it didn't cease in many respects being theologically Catholic. And so in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, the first one, it, like Luther and like Calvin, sought to restore the primacy of Sunday and the association of Sunday with the Eucharist. So it was very consistent there. Fridays were designated as fast days, kind of continuing this pre-Reformation idea. And their calendar in that 1549 book was much the same as what Luther had proposed or what the Lutherans had done. So there was this continuation kind of Lutheran theology in that regard into the Reformation. In the 1552 prayer book, we're concerned about revising the prayer book after the 79 book, coming up on 50 years old. Here's one in 3 years. You can do this pretty quickly. In the 1552 prayer book, they added some other days, what were called black letter days. And one of these was St. George, which, the association of George in Britain goes back. There was a feast of St. Peter in Chains that was known as Lammas Day, Lammas. And so if you remember your Tolkien and the fellowship of the Lammas bread, we've got more Lammas bread. So here's this association with Lammas Day. Another day that was added was St. Lawrence and then St. Clement. So there were some other what were called black letter days, not these big ticket guys like the apostles and the evangelists, but there were some others that were begun to be added. 10 years later, the church developed what was called the Articles of Religion. And this was kind of the definition of who Anglicans were. And we have these in the back of our prayer book. You can go back and read them. There are some, I remember, one of them is that the liturgy shall be said in a language understood by the people. So no more Latin Mass. Okay? Or at least you had to be able to understand that. But Article 22 of the Articles of Religion was on purgatory. This is where we're distinguishing ourselves from those, the Roman Catholic theology of the time. Article 22 reads, "The Romish doctrine concerning purgatory, pardons, worshiping and adoration, as well of images as of relics, and also invocation of saints, is a fond thing vainly invented and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the Word of God." So we're beginning to see the influence of Calvinism here. We're also seeing that British theology or Reformation English theology, since a lot of the doctrine of purgatory was based on books not in the generally accepted canon, but based on books that were in the Apocrypha. So this is why it's not grounded on the warranty of Scripture, but found in another book. And why I said in my sermon this morning, while the Apocrypha can be used for teaching, but not for the establishment of doctrine, that is still our theology in the Episcopal Church. So in the 39 Articles in 1562, you're not supposed to do that anymore. It's a fond thing vainly invented, this worshiping of saints. And that being said, there were Latin versions of the prayer book because there were still Christians in Britain that were worshiping very much as Roman Catholics. There were others that were worshiping more as Protestants. There was a Latin version of the prayer book in the Church of England. And in 1561, they added 60 black letter days to that prayer book. 1662, they added St. Alban and St. Bede. So there were some differences going on in Britain. There wasn't sort of a single thing going on. Then there was this Book of Martyrs, Fox's Book of Martyrs, that chronicled the suffering of Protestants under the Catholic Church. When we had Mary Queen of Scots, right? Bloody Mary's reign. There were Protestants who were killed. And so the Book of Martyrs recorded those. And then, you know, with Oliver Cromwell and certainly influence of Calvin with John Knox, there was iconoclasm throughout the Commonwealth. And so that's what this picture is of on the right, of statues being taken out and being burned. That this was the big iconoclastic period in Britain, and you can still go through, not that I've been there, but I've certainly seen pictures, and those of you who have been can talk about going through Britain and seeing, you know, what the Cromwellians and all of the Puritans did in the churches and cathedrals, the destruction of all of these things. So in the English church, we inherited in the US this sort of theology, this interesting theology of how we want to deal with saints. So, you know, this classic question, what's being remembered, how and why? We've got a number of things. If we think about our history, we've got the Reformation changing the nature of how those saints were being remembered, the number being lessened. Why? Because of the connection with the change in the Reformation and all the theological changes there. I want to get to this last slide and then, or these last two slides, and then I'll take some questions and then we'll have to quit. So when all of this came to the US, we had basically those core commemorations that we've already talked about in the 1789 prayer book, when the US developed its own prayer book after the Revolution. That first one was in 1789. And basically from 1789 to 1928, there wasn't much change. The core calendars are the feasts of the Lord and a few others. And I'm going to show you what those are. Here is the calendar of the church according to the 28 prayer book. Right? You got the Feast of the Epiphany, you got Conversion to St. Paul tomorrow. You got the Purification, St. Matthias, the Annunciation, St. Mark, St. Philip and James, St. Barnabas, Nativity of St. John the Baptist, St. Peter, Independence Day, St. James, so it's pretty bare. It's really bare. And that's where our calendar begins to develop, from which our calendar begins to develop. So the reform or the revision of the 1928 prayer book was pretty dramatic, and it started well before the work on the 1979 prayer book. But it was pretty dramatic, and it really had an impact on this chart, on this calendar, as we'll see when we reconvene in 2 weeks. We'll see the revisions coming through, and you'll see the first real one was Lesser Feasts and Fasts in 1963, and it moved up through 2006 Lesser Feasts and Fasts, and then more recently Holy Women, Holy Men, and then this great cloud of witnesses, where there's hardly a day in the calendar that does not have somebody on it. A far cry from this. And so that's what we'll be talking about the final 2 sessions before we run into Lent, where we'll pick this back up the first Sunday of February. So any questions before we sort of sign off? Any thoughts?
I like learning about all the people who lived in 200 CE or 300 CE. I like the continuity of knowing who they were. I'm not one to worship, but I am one to appreciate them.
Yep. And why were they remembered? One of the things, and I'll say more about this in a couple of weeks, that people were noticing in some of the early versions of Lesser Feasts and Fasts, or in the versions of the calendar, that the people that were remembered hovered around 3 centuries. The 3rd century, like the 14th century, and then the 19th century. And the question is, why those centuries? So there's those around the Reformation, there were those around the persecutions. And then in the American prayer book, the 19th century has to do a lot with Anglican missionary activity. So it's what did you want to remember? And so if you hold that in mind, we'll see how that shifts as we move through the latter half of the 20th century. Other thoughts, questions?
Gary, I follow your Twitter account, and so every day you say, today we remember. Where does that list come from?
That list is primarily the most recent version of
Great Cloud.
Lesser Feasts and Fasts, not the Great Cloud.
Oh,
It's I've been sort of following the last officially approved version of Lesser Feasts and Fasts.
Because it's ecumenical, it's all different religions.
Pardon?
It's ecumenical in the sense that it's all different religions. Like I remember one was a Buddhist.
Oh, well, that I get from an interfaith calendar.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I'm very clear to say, our Buddhist neighbors are celebrating this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's different. But yeah, I've decided, at least with that calendar, to sort of go by what the last official acceptance of the Episcopal Church was, which I think is in 2009. And then Holy Women and Holy Men came later, and Great Cloud of Witness came even later. So that yeah, I'll share the link to the lectionary page that I use for that next time around. All right. Carla, you trying to ask?
Is there time for a comment about Cromwell and the
Go ahead.
destruction? Well, it's a subject for another time, but the destruction, how they, I'm not sure of the verb, but when I visited Ely Cathedral, and I was appalled at the destruction of the stained glass windows. And so we're talking about remembrance, and I still don't get it. What is the problem with stained glass windows where we get to remember the Bible stories and people that came before us? I've never been able to reconcile that in destruction, how there can be such destruction in the name of God. That's a big question.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that the short answer is, it goes back to that early commandment, thou shalt make no graven image. And so therefore, the dividing line between learning, adoration, veneration, all of those kinds of things is a moving target. And that's what in the 8th century, all of the debates about iconoclasm were in the early church. And that picked up again with Calvin. So it went away, but it picked up again with Calvin. And that concern about iconoclasm is reflected in the Muslim concern about depicting any living being. As soon as you depict it, so this has a long history in religious thought, not just Calvin, or not even just in Christian thought. So yeah, what's that fine line?
Well, that's for another class.
There we go. All right, everyone, I got another service to do here shortly, so look forward to seeing you next week, if not before. Thank you so much.
Have a good week.
Yep, everybody have a great week. And I may, once I start doing, I'll tell you all that later. Anyway, take care.
Okay, bye.